Thank you. My name is Daniel Mutibwa, and together with my colleagues, Sophie and Paulina, we're grateful to have you here with us this afternoon. One of our plans this afternoon was to, if we had a smaller group, was to sort of have a semicircle and do lots of talking and exchange. So we do appreciate that you've been talked at a lot this afternoon. So we are going to try and make it as interactive as possible. But if you feel that you're not in the mood of exchanging your ideas or just sharing your thoughts, that's also okay. And we were thinking, we were aiming for the session to be about 90 minutes without a break. But if the conversation is flowing and is going well, and it takes us to the full time that we've been allotted, we could take a break halfway through. So we are happy to negotiate that with you, just to check in to see how you're feeling. So just a bit of an overview. We're going to do some introductions, and we are going to ask you to introduce yourselves as well. Some of you know each other already, but there is some thinking behind why we would like to know a little bit more about you. We will then, we've divided this into 4 parts. So the introductory bit will be part 1, or what we are calling part 1. What we are calling part 2 is what we, academic policy engagement in culture-based work. Very, very heavy sounding words, okay, that probably you're thinking, what are they talking about? Or what is he talking about? So this is sort of the session where we'll try to break that down in terms of what we mean by culture-based work in the context of our project and what we mean by academic policy engagement. And we will again appreciate your ideas and views and perspectives on what you think, or if that tallies with what you know or with what you do in your work. In what we are calling part 3, is here visioning a creative and cultural county, developing Leicestershire County Council's cultural strategy. We're going to try and put what we are saying in practice, so the definitions and perhaps maybe the conceptual approach of academic policy engagement and culture-based work. We're going to look at that through the prism or through the lens of a project we've been involved with policymakers, regional policymakers in a county in the East Midlands called Leicestershire, and we'll be providing some background information and how the project then came to be. And we'll be ending the session with what we are calling part 4, and that is sort of visioning the future of of partnerships involving academics, policymakers, and local communities in relation to culture-based work. Some of this might be familiar in the work you've done yourselves. We'll be sharing what we think those should look like, but we would invite you to feed in as well in terms of what you think, if you were involved in those partnerships, or if you know of people involved in those partnerships, what they would like to see happen there, given those different stakeholders, if you like, that do not normally interact or come together in the same space. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself first, and then I'll hand over to Sophie, and then to Paulina, and then we'll hand over to you. So my name is, as I say, Daniel Mutibwa. I'm a Ugandan. I'm based at the University of Nottingham, UK campus. You might know that the University of Nottingham has 3 campuses, one in Ningbo and one in Kuala Lumpur, but I'm based at the one in the UK. My formal title is Associate Professor in Creative Industries and Digital Culture, which doesn't really say very much, but what I do, or what I'm interested in, is how the cultural, creative, media, heritage, and digital economy industries restructure themselves over time in response to social, economic, political, technological, ecological, and even policy-related developments in society. And how then, in turn, that has an impact on the nature of work, so cultural work, if you like, and the nature of outputs that are produced in those industries, and how those then shape policy. So I've increasingly grown interested in that area. The methodologies or methodological approaches I've drawn upon mainly ethnography and co-production traditions, which I don't normally like to assume that people know these things, but very briefly, ethnography, I understand that as the study of social formations or human groups and communities in their naturally occurring environment. So in this context, the context of culture, media, heritage, and digital economy industries, that involves studying the workplaces of people who work or people who work in those places. Co-production is very much about building in inclusive and participatory approaches to engagement and the shaping of research, either wholly, so across a whole project or parts of the project. And co-production as a methodological approach is going to resurface in what we'll be saying shortly. So I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who will, after introducing herself, will hand over to Paulina. Sophie, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophie. I wear a few different hats, but I am now a lecturer in creative leadership at the University for the Creative Arts, which is just south of London, in Epsom in the UK. I'm also a research fellow in the Institute for Digital Culture at the University of Leicester, and that kind of starts my East Midlands link, because obviously we're going to talk about Leicestershire a little bit later, and I've worked in and around Leicester with different cultural communities and cultural stakeholders for a few years now. And that's what led me to getting involved in Daniel's project with the University of Nottingham. So since January, we'll talk about this a bit later, but since January, I've been an associate on Daniel's project, looking at how we develop a cultural strategy with a regional county council. I've got loads of other things I could say about my research background. My main interest is in the impact of technology on cultural work, like in subsidised public arts organisations. And I might probably throw in a few things about digital literacy a bit later on. So yeah, just, a warning. But I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Daniel and Sophie, for inviting me to this panel. I'm Paulina Fava. I'm associated professor at the University of Chile. I have worked in many projects related to cultural heritage and art. At the moment, I'm participating as a principal researcher in Anillos project about mestizo cultural heritage, and I'm also working with in another project with 3 artists, contemporary artists, Abraham Cruz Villegas from Mexico, Fernanda Gomez from Brazil, and Liliana Maresca, who unfortunately died in the 1990s, from Argentina. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paulina and Sophie. So Paulina has very kindly joined us on this panel because we're looking to develop some work together around academic policy engagement. And I've had a brief conversation with Thomas Peters as well in relation to how we might work together on and around some of the themes that have been raised at this conference. Okay. What I would like us to do next is to hand the baton over to you. Okay, we don't want you to. Well, we don't want to sound undiplomatic. Nobody's falling asleep, but we want to keep you awake as awake as you can possibly be. And one way to do that is to pass around the microphone and just ask you to say your name. Valentina is already on the move. Just say your first name, and you're very welcome to say your nickname, whichever you prefer. We're going to spend the next perhaps 60, 90 minutes together here, so just knowing your first name or your nickname is not a bad thing over 90 minutes, is it? Okay, and it will keep us awake as well. Okay, so we're going to ask you to say your name, nickname or first name. We are going to ask you to share what you do for a living. Okay, you don't have to, but we would welcome you if you shared that, because we want to see how that then might connect to some of the things we've been saying about culture-based work, that very strange and ambiguous word. And we would like you to say one word, please, only one word, that you instinctively associate with the term culture, or that ambiguous term culture-based work. Okay, so without consciously thinking very much, if somebody says culture-based work or culture, what do you immediately think about? Normally with these things, we don't want to put you on the spot, so I'll go first. I already said my name is Daniel. I'm an academic at a university. That's what I do for a living. When I instinctively think about a word associated with culture, the first word is inspiration. Now, you can add a sentence or two about why you want to do that, and that's okay. My sentence I would add is, I think about inspiration because I'm one person who works with text very much, so the written words. Okay, I work quite a lot with text and written words. However, as I've grown older, I've come to understand that actually engaging with other genres, like the visual arts, so if I look at a painting, if I look at perhaps maybe a piece of drama, theatre, or if I look at just a multimedia installation, or find myself engaging with an immersive experience, it gives me, or it opens up a new opportunity for me to absorb, reflect, understand the world around me in a way that written text alone doesn't. Okay, hence inspiration. The word was inspiration. So over to you. Yes, I'll leave it to Valentina to determine where we start, and we'll be taking some notes.
My name is Amarilis. What I do for a living, I'm doing a PhD on arts policies in Portugal, and I'm an economist. And my word is pleasure.
Hello, my name is Matias. I work as a researcher at CONICET in Argentina. I'm a sociologist. And the word that came into my mind related with culture is meanings. Meanings.
Buenas tardes, soy Gustavo Aguirre, periodista y gestor cultural independiente y músico aficionado. La segunda. Ya. Yo creo que la cultura es un proceso creativo. Y creo que la mejor palabra o el mejor concepto es la experiencia vivencial.
Hello, everyone. I'm Norma. I work as associate professor at the University of Santiago de Chile, and my word is human being.
Hi, my name is Cecilia. I'm an academic at the British University, also a sociologist. And my word, I think, is excitement.
Hi, my name is Cheka. I'm part of the CREAS team as a coordinator and also a media artist and researcher. My favorite word is, I think, pleasure or enjoyment. someone over there said also. And I think that's all, right?
Hello, my name is Constanza. I'm journalist at the University of Chile. I'm part of the team of Checa, same. And my word associated with culture is simply art.
Hi, my name is Thomas. I work at the University of Chile. I am a sociologist as well, and my word is conflict.
Hi, my name is Juliana. I am a professor of cultural production at the Federal Institute of Brasilia in Brazil. And my word is social justice.
Hello, my name is Tamsin. You can call me Tam. I'm a lecturer in cultural work at King's College London, and my word is problematic.
David was director until very recently of the National Museum Wales, now visiting professor at Cardiff University in cultural policy. And my word is elite.
Hi, I'm Aude Le Guenec. I'm a research lead at Glasgow School of Art, UK, Scotland. And my word is for all.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for, your words too.
I feel like I want to change my word now because I've heard elite and problematic and conflict, but my word was freedom.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know why, but my first word was life.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. So a very quick summary: life, freedom, for all, elite, problematic, social justice, conflict, art, pleasure/enjoyment, excitement, human beings, lived experience, meanings, and pleasure makes it to the top place because it's been mentioned twice. Okay. Thank you very much for those contributions. Could it be that the people who contributed later on had time to think? Could it be? Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't matter why. Okay. So hopefully we're going to make clear, to become clear why this is useful. So we had a similar exercise when we started out on this project, which we are going to introduce in a moment. And we had policymakers, we had creative practitioners, we had local communities, mainly volunteers who take part in cultural programs designed by the Leicestershire County Council, but also they are volunteers, so project participants and volunteers. And you wouldn't believe the list of things we collected, what people associated with culture. And that got us thinking about, if it's this diverse, just within, say, Leicestershire County Council as an organization, or just within the county of Leicestershire, what would it be like from a global perspective then? Okay, do we think of culture, or do we perceive of culture the same way? So that will come in conversation as we go on. So I would like us to move, thank you again for those contributions. I would like us now to move to part two, what we are calling part two. And that's where we want to unpack the terms culture-based work and academic policy engagement in the context of what we are talking about today, okay? So when we talk about culture-based work, certainly in this session, the project we're going to introduce shortly, we are talking about work that happens in libraries, in archives, museums, the arts, and the creative industries. And we thought a good way to do that is to work with the definition of the policy partner we're working with. So this is a definition of Leicestershire County Council in relation to culture. So they name things like engagement with the past, present, and future, tangible and intangible heritage, experiences and memories, stories, myths and legends, faiths and religions, buildings, that reminds us of the session yesterday that David Anderson led with the piece, museums are not only a building. That's what I think about instantly. There's buildings, villages, cities, and landscapes, art, dance, music, and food. In one of the panels, I think on Tuesday, one of the speakers talked about how Peru is developing food as a key and distinctive cultural output. I found that very interesting. Treasured and meaningful objects and possessions, creative learning, and value and belief systems. Further afield, taking the definition of the Arts Council of England, which is an arm's length organization in England that champions the arts and culture. They talk about areas of activity associated with much of what we've seen in the first definition, which is associated with collections, combined arts, dance, libraries, literature, museums, music, theatre, and the visual arts. So that's the definition that the Arts Council provides. So I'd just like to pause here for a second, or would just like to pause here for a second. Is there anything, if you were asked to add to that list, is there anything you would add? Or do you feel strongly that something might be missing off of that list? David, sorry. Oh, Norma, did you say people? Oh, that's interesting. May I push a little bit and say, how is... Oh, you bring the microphone, I think. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I don't know how say that in English, but I don't know, maybe people engagement, compromiso, I don't know how say that. Commitment. People commitment.
Oh, okay. Interesting, people commitment. Yes, David.
Health and healing.
Health and healing, yes. David, would you want to say a sentence, health and healing?
The definition of culture for me is very broad there, but I would say that it's every part of people's lives. And therefore the connections across to all the other parts should be recognized in some way.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much, David. Thompson, did you have your hand up? Yes. Sorry, is it the mic there for you? Yeah.
I think just agreeing with David's point, but adding education.
Oh, right. Okay. It's interesting you're saying that, Thompson, actually, because Leicestershire County Council, when they say creative learning, it's part of their education offer where they invite schools and other learning institutions to engage with their collections. That was inspiring students. But yes, education, perhaps a bit more explicitly. Thank you very much, Thompson, David, and Norma. Any other contributions? Yes, please. Oh, yes, innovation, yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, innovation, yes, I think that's a really good word. Innovation, yes. Okay, anything else? We don't want to leave one of us out? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
Traditional knowledge, I don't know if
Yes, traditional, yeah.
Knowledge. No? I don't know if it's in the list.
Would that normally be accounted for in intangible heritage, do we think? Or would that warrant? Sorry? No? Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, yes. Okay. Digital. Yeah, right, okay. So the digital as well, okay. I think, yes, I think that's a very valid point indeed. The digital, okay. So the digital, education, innovation, health and healing, all very interesting additions. Okay, so one of the ways in which Leicestershire County Council, the organization we're going to talk about today, engages with culture-based work is by facilitating a number of things. One of those is participation in arts activities, so local communities, members of the public taking part in cultural activities, but also acting as attendees of those events, okay, regardless of whether they've been put on by professionals or amateurs. It's about the use of public library services, okay? And as we are going to talk about, Leicestershire County Council has 51 heritage sites spread out across the county, and a lot of those are libraries in different formats, okay? So it's very important to them to develop or to cultivate the use of their libraries through their public library provision. But it's also about facilitating visits to museums. And they have quite a number of museums as well across the county, but as well as science sites and science parks as well. It's about facilitating visits to places of historic interest, okay? So just earlier today we were talking about, they have one in particular called the 1620 Manor House, where people can go and get a feel for what it felt like living in a manor house in England in the 16th century. Not everybody's cup of tea, but certainly something of interest to some people. There is also participation in sports. Okay, sometimes I actually expected to hear the word sport in associations with culture, okay? So I think the UK has a whole department, a whole ministry that looks after the media, the digital, culture, and sport, okay? We might ask where the connection comes in, but maybe we might get to that later on. And the last bit here regards volunteering. Okay, so volunteer is people volunteering as perhaps maybe museum stewards or museum researchers in those capacities. So having looked at what we think is culture-based work in the context of this session, we would like to move on to the next big word, which is academic policy engagement in this work, okay? So when we talk about academics and policymakers coming together along with communities to shape and facilitate access to culture-based work, so the things we've been talking about, what tends to happen there? A lot of this was said yesterday in both keynote speeches by Eleonora Belfiore and Ben Wamsley. But one of the things that we're seeing here is that these activities do not take place because the local government authorities love culture or they love the arts per se, but it's mainly instrumentalized, okay, used as a vehicle to achieve other things. And there's been a lot of critique around the instrumentalization of the arts and culture, or what Ben Wamsley specifically termed new instrumentalism, whereby the arts and culture are used more or less to patch up where public services have failed to deliver efficiently. And there are quite a number of objectives that align very much with what in the UK is called the levelling up agenda and the devolution agenda. Okay, so the levelling up agenda being, very quickly, because this was mentioned yesterday, but for the benefit of those of us here who did not attend Ben Walmsley's keynote speech, it's very much about reducing the structural inequalities across the UK. So historically, for those of you who are familiar with the UK, London and the Southeast, maybe to some extent the Southwest, have sort of had the lion's share of public funding and resources. And that has very much been the case in the arts and culture sector. And the government realizes that there's a need to try and bridge and close that gap in provision. Devolution is very much about transferring power, again, from the central government to local areas, okay? Because the feeling is that only local authorities are in a position to innovatively and flexibly respond to the needs in those particular areas, not necessarily that happening from London, from a distance. So that's sort of the understanding. I won't go too much into the levelling up missions. There are 4 overarching ones. So one simply being using the arts and culture to boost productivity and boost living standards. And that's done by growing the public sector. So one of the things we've been looking at in this project, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, is how Leicestershire County Council as an organization is trying to get creative practitioners to make use of their museum assets, to make use of their library assets, to make use of their archival collections, okay, in a way that helps them to grow their creative businesses. Now, we could debate about whether that's the way to go, because it very much sounds like a very neoliberal logic, and it will be interesting to hear perspectives from other parts of the world. The second point is very much about using the arts and culture to restore a sense of community, restore a sense of local pride, and to restore a sense of belonging. And that's being done by funding cultural and sports programs, or regenerating provinces and regions, say things like giving the high streets an uplift, so that they can be attractive to tourists, perhaps coming into the area to bring or to support local businesses. The third is about empowering local leaders and communities where particularly local agency has been lacking. So things like, again, transferring that power to local authorities so that they make decisions around supporting local businesses, around putting out public skills learning or training for youth, young people, or people who have been disconnected from the employment market. So I'll pause there for a second and invite Sophie and Paulina, if you would like, is there anything you would like to add
yes.
to that? Yeah.
As you know, Daniel, I'm deeply cynical of academic policy engagement in whatever culture-based work means, which we think seems to mean everything. And I really question, and I invite people to criticize me on this, but I really question what the role of the researcher is when you're building relationships like that. Those A, B, C to F seem to me highly uncritical. And I start to think when I look at that, so what is our role? Are we working at service to kind of validate the decisions already of policymakers? So I've tried hard throughout this project, I think, I try to think, well, what would it take to have a critical position on academic policy engagement? What's, those two definitions at the beginning, that they've very much been put together by policymakers at service of something, where's the power? And I want to think about that in my bit of that academic policymaker relationship. Something I've thought about a lot is, are we on the outside looking in, or are we on the inside looking out when we build relationships like that? You know, they are fraught, so I think about that quite a lot. And something we haven't talked about, but I've done quite a lot of work working inside arts organisations, thinking about how can I be critical when I want to gain data and access to what they're thinking. And I think there's this thing about you can take something an academic called Thomas Osborne calls like an ethno-critical stance to your position, both on the inside and the outside. So I would just really encourage us to think about that, because I think it is really fraught. And I guess I would also say, you know, why should our priorities as researchers, universities, academics, or just critical thinkers of any kind be the same as policymakers? You know, surely that's not the point. So I'm in the UK, there's been a huge push to fund more academic policy partnerships, and I'm highly critical of it. That's all I want to say.
Yes, thank you. I think the work of academics in public policy is very important, but I think that I think that Thomas maybe has more experience in terms of public policy, but I think that there's a twofold like a twofold reality or context in relation to the work of academics in public policy, because we can bring evidence, we can engage deeply in, for instance, in the different perspectives around categories, institutional categories, how people use these categories for practices that are very different from what institutions thought that they will be used. So that's one point. But I think that what Sophie says, no, the problem is that academics can be also instrumentalized and can be also in this situation that we can legitimize not some of the directions that a public policy can have, no, in order to, for instance, make people responsible, no, for their cultural engagement, no, and not giving any guarantee in relation to what public policy can make and guarantee to a project that is going to develop through many years. No?
Thank you very much, both Paulina and Sophie, for that very critical stance, and it's very welcome. I think this is a welcoming and safe space, indeed. Interestingly, Paulina kind of threw the ball to Thomas in a way, not intentionally. But maybe since that's happened, Thomas, no, you prefer not to go there, is it? Okay. Have you got any thoughts? Because it's tough. You know, you've got academics and you've got policymakers, and both sets of stakeholders have got their own agendas. They've got their own motivations. Conflict is inevitable. Disagreement is inevitable. Disagreement can be healthy, but to a point where it doesn't jeopardize the partnership. Are there any experiences or any thoughts? Yes, the microphone is coming to you. Thanks, Thompson.
I can share a recent experience. Is there a translation? Just checking. No? Okay, I can. I've just come out of I have to be a bit careful. I've just come out of a research project for that was commissioned by what we call an all-party parliamentary group, which is a group of politicians. This is at a national government level from different parties, different political parties, and there are all sorts of all-party parliamentary groups. There's one, I think, for stamp collecting. You know, it's sort of not. It's very bizarre. But this one got some funding from some different agencies and commissioned us to write a report on creative education. So it sort of speaks to what you were just saying, Sophie, because the research brought up quite a lot of criticism, unsurprisingly, on how creative and cultural education has featured in UK educational policy in the last 20 years, and the impact that's had on who is able, therefore, to study creative and cultural education at a higher education level, and then in turn access the industry, which was what we were looking at. We were looking at pathways. And I felt a real freezing from the politicians because of the criticism, and it's quite a political time in the UK now. But then I also found with the stakeholders that we'd spoken to, because we had a series of roundtable meetings, that you feel a sense of obligation to them. So after it had been after the report had been announced, a lot of these stakeholders from either education institutions or arts institutions were sort of saying to us, the academics, what do we do next? But we were like, well, we don't have any power. You know, it's not, we've made our recommendations and we've passed them on, but we can't do anything more. And so it feels sometimes, I think it's really important to do the work, because I think it's important to have that criticality and have that view, but I think you're always slightly in the middle, and you have to be quite careful of your positionality and quite clear that, you know, all we can do is our job, and it's really not us to make the actual decisions, it's for them to decide what to do with it. I don't know if that's too long, sorry.
No, not at all, Tam. I think you've captured it really well. So taking Sophie and Paulina's critique, and also putting a positive spin on it and saying it's work that needs to be done. Somebody will do it anyway. And we were having that conversation around, it's an opportunity for us as academics and researchers to actually maybe contribute to shaping policymakers' attitudes and maybe ways of thinking, in the hope that maybe those might be taken up. They might not be taken up, but we've done our bit and we don't have any more power beyond that. So it's a tricky situation. Thank you very much indeed. Were there any other thoughts before? Yes, Emma, please. Sorry, was it Emma or Emily?
Amarilis.
Oh, Emma, all right. Okay,
no, it's very strange. No, I like to share my experience, because I'm part of arts organization also, and I've took a lot of reunions with the cultural ministry and that, mostly in the pandemic. And I think that's one thing that it's important for academics to know is that we're not needed to intermediate artists and policymakers, because this connection is done better directly. So that's a role we don't have. And that's important to know that, like, be more, less arrogant about that, because artists, they think also, they have ideas, they have critical thinking. I think that also there's another thing that policymakers don't want from academics critical thought. They want data. They want us to map the sector, to do audience research. They want data and maybe that we organize data. They don't want critical thought because they think they do that part. So I think that for us, if you want to take part in the conversation, the academics, we have to take part in the dispute. So maybe you can join an arts organization that do that kind of dispute, or in our academic point, or you can join maybe a political party or something, but that's the way we can enter in the dispute. That's some thought, maybe too aggressive, but...
Thank you very much, Emma. Very interesting points there. So what I'm hearing through is, yes, Audrey will be coming in. What I'm hearing through is that attempts to mediate between policymakers and the arts and culture sector are probably not a good idea. And the second point being that policymakers / politicians are averse to critical, to critical thought, or they think they can do that themselves. So, and I think we've got some experience there where they talk about they're interested in what works. And of course, that's problematic in terms of what works, because what works is not always the best, for the public good as well. So there are conversations there to be had. Audrey, please.
Aude. It's fine.
Oh,
my name is Aude.
Aude,
Not Audrey.
Apologies, Aude, please. Yeah.
Don't worry. It's great that you remember my name. So I just wanted to say I agree deeply with what Emma was saying, having been involved in an all-party consultation as well in the context of Dress for School, where French politicians wanted to know more about school uniforms. What I found out is that we, in this instance, it was academics and museum people, but both sectors involved in the same research. So we were there with our data, yeah? And also to highlight unexpected information that they might have overlooked about the repercussion of any decision that they would make. In this instance, it was about school uniforms, so they hadn't thought about the role of the fashion industry, which we have been able to highlight and enhance thanks to the research we had made about this topic. And I truly agree, as a true French girl, that the contribution is in the disruption. As academics, we can obviously support the construction of policies, but we have to question them. And this is done in the not in the background, but in the responsible debate that we have the responsibility to hold.
Very interesting thoughts, Aude. Thank you very much indeed. So before we move on, are there any other thoughts? Matthias, did you have your hand up? Oh yes, please, of course.
But in Buenos Aires, I do a research with person belonging to small theaters, cultural centers, and music clubs that are organizing and claim to the states different things, and continues with what Marilis said. For our experience in work with them, try to design indicators to measure the sector and to reflect some demands. We tried to reflect with them and establish some kind of, how can I say, some tables to reflect with them and identify some specific problematics, and from that try to identify some dimension and element that could be important for them to show to the policymakers. And our role in some way was to help them to reflect or reflect with them. So I think this is a specific contribution from the academics to the stakeholders, for instance. Not just mediated between the stakeholder and policymaker, but also helped the stakeholder to reflect or reflect with them, to clarify their demands and to construct, to build with them the knowledge and help them to claim specific things regarding to the politicians, for instance.
Okay. So that thread continues, that the contribution that academics can make, whether that's data, whether that's perspectives, to the decision-making process. Okay, I would like to suggest that we continue. Valentina, how are we doing for time? So it's 3:15.
Yeah, we have until 4.
We have until 4, all right, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Valentina. Okay, so moving on to what we are calling part 3, which is sort of walking you through the project itself. So the project is called Visioning a Creative and Cultural County, Developing Leicestershire County Council's Culture Strategy. And just some brief background information before I hand over to Sophie to provide the sort of wider county-wide perspective on what Leicestershire, so why Leicestershire as a place. So the project was an academic policy impact research collaboration between the University of Nottingham, so Sophie came over to the University of Nottingham to join me as a co-investigator, and Leicestershire County Council, located in the East Midlands, of which Sophie is going to say a little bit more in a moment. The project was funded by a funding scheme called the Research England Quality-Related Policy Support Fund, and it's that fund particularly supports academic policy partnerships that are engaged not only in culture-based work or the arts and culture sector, but more broadly across different realms. What we set out to do was to produce a culture strategy for Leicestershire County Council, one that strategically aligns culture, the arts, heritage, creative practice / creative industries across the county. Midway through the project, it became very clear that we wouldn't be able to do that, certainly not within 9 months, okay? And there are lots of other things we can talk about in relation to communication, so communicating objectives and managing expectations, but that would have been a tall order to ask. Because for a culture strategy actually to make it to the regional parliament, there is a process that takes 3 years. Okay, before it can, there's a process that takes 3 years until the culture strategy actually develops through to a policy itself. Okay, so that wasn't very clear to us, although we actually collaboratively developed the proposal with our colleagues, but perhaps we'll speak more to that. But what I wanted to say before handing over to Sophie to first of all provide that sort of Leicestershire, so county-wide perspective, was that it was a good time in January to do this project. Why? That was because during the autumn of 2022, so September, October, November, Leicestershire County Council, in the midst of very austere times, so successive public funding, managed to get 2 major pots of funding. The first one was from what you would call the Ministry of Culture elsewhere, but it's the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. They run a program called Create Growth Program. And what that program does is to support regions like the East Midlands or West Midlands, coming together, bring together a number of counties to bid for funding to support creative, cultural and heritage activity. And that amounted to 1.2 million over a period of 3 years. So that was a major boost to them. And the other major boost was that the unit we were working with, and I'll speak a little bit more to that after Sophie has introduced Leicestershire as a place and some of the dynamics at play, was that a unit called the Libraries and Heritage Services within the council secured national portfolio organization status. For those of us here who are not quite familiar with the British context, the national portfolio organization status really is just a scheme whereby arts and cultural organizations bid for funding or apply for funding to invest in their artistic and cultural programs. So those arts and cultural organizations could be run by local authorities, but they could also be run by charities, or what we call the volunteer, community, faith, and social enterprise sector. Okay, so that really depends. So in this particular instance, Leicestershire County Council was fortunate to have secured that over the next 3 years until 2026. And what's interesting about that, it's part of the Arts Council of England that I mentioned earlier. And what's interesting about that is that it's 750,000. Okay, so for local governments working on very tight budgets, that's quite a huge boost. So before we go into further specifics, Sophie, this is where I would like to invite you to then speak to the Leicestershire County as a place and all the dynamics at play.
Well, I think maybe it's worth just saying, has anyone here been to Leicestershire? Woo! We got 3 in the room. So you can speak to Leicestershire as well. So I guess, when we're thinking about writing this cultural, I'm really pleased you talked about the Arts Council funding because, LCC then strongly felt they needed to write a cultural strategy off the back of that. So we were there thinking, okay, we're going to help them get the next round of MPO status funding in 3 years' time. So that's part of our, mindset. But one of our first questions was, well, what is Leicestershire? What constitutes Leicestershire? What are the parameters? Who do we include? And it became very clear from the first focus groups we ran with different stakeholders across the council that there was a lot of polite disagreement, actually, about what should and shouldn't be included within the remit of a county council's cultural strategy. So we had to sort of start figuring that out. And I guess the way I did it was just thinking, well, we really need to include everything in how we think about that. I'm just going to refer to some notes because I'm going to forget what I want to say. So one of the first things that someone on the council said is they quoted Bill Bryson, the travel author, who said, Leicestershire is as beautiful as the Cotswolds, but no one knows about it, which was a mindset felt quite a lot across everyone we spoke to, that how can we use a cultural strategy to create a greater sense of pride of place, basically, was a lot of the language we were coming up with. One of the things I started doing with thinking the parameters of Leicestershire and who is Leicestershire is gathering information through the 2021 census data. So the last time we'd had the census was 2011. So we were looking at how the sort of demographic had changed. Leicestershire is quite a unique place. It's very middle of the road in some ways, literally, and right in the middle of England, because at its heart, it has Leicester City, which is obviously one of the most diverse populations in the UK. But then if you look at the county, that's really quite the opposite. So there has been a growing population in Leicestershire in the last 10 years, particular increases in the older population. To be honest, it's an ageing, white, middle class, fairly affluent population. Obviously, there are pockets of diversity, but not loads. It's less religious than it was. There's a very high proportion of people with at least bachelor's degrees, so it's quite a qualified area. And there's other trends, like more people were living in rented accommodation, but that's the case across all of the UK. We looked at things like the gross added value from the arts, entertainment and recreation in Leicestershire, and it was 105 million, which was actually for 2021, which is actually quite low in relation to other parts of the country, but that's actually mainly because Leicestershire is quite affluent, so it was making quite a lot of money in other ways. We had some support from the business insights team at the council, and they were very, very happy to share data insights with us because they didn't know how to analyse them. I'm not sure if I've completely figured out how to analyse them yet, but we got some really interesting statistics. I gave them the Department of Culture, Media, Sports SIC codes. They're like business codes that you measure different subsectors within all industries in the UK. So I gave them the creative industry and the cultural industries one, and they ran a whole thing about how many people were estimated to be employed in the cultural sector in 2021. And actually, I wrote this down, overall, they thought in the cultural sector in Leicestershire, there was 1,775 people who were working in some way in the cultural industries. Slightly different from the creative industries. Most common was actually library and archives and artistic creation. So read it, but again, very vague on what that is. But also within these parameters, we need to say we were working with two main partners in the council, Cultural Leicestershire, that received all that funding, and Creative Leicestershire, which was a kind of networking, I don't know, how would you describe Creative Leicestershire? It was disbanding as we got involved with them. They had been a kind of much more creative industry focused, advice, support, networking kind of side of the county council that had done really well in previous years, but since the pandemic, their funding had dried up. The council had stopped seeing that it was important to fund what they were offering, and everything was being funneled into Culture Leicestershire. So I was thinking a lot about their remit. And the only other thing to say, I think, on parameters, obviously, and I'm saying we're including everything out with and inside the council's remit, was that there are 5 market towns in Leicestershire. I won't rattle them off because I don't expect you to have heard of them, but they all considered themselves in their own right to be quite cultural, creative hubs. And I think there was a certain rivalry between them as well. So we were thinking about the role of them and also of local artists. Again, there was quite a lot of stridency amongst the artist community, feeling like they'd been ignored by the council up till then. So that was all included in our parameters. I don't know if that covers what Leicestershire is. Maybe it does a bit, but we were thinking about all these things and their dynamics as we were going through this, weren't we?
Thank you very much for that indeed, Sophie. And there's actually lots more that we were engaging with, but we wouldn't want to bore you with details. One of the things that I think is really helpful to say is that Leicestershire County Council as an organisation has 6 directorates. The first one of those being corporate services, so that deals with HR, so human resources, and finance. It's got environment and transport, so obviously dealing with environment, transport, highways, and waste. It has another directorate called the Adults and Communities Directorate, which is responsible for adult social care, adult learning, but bizarrely, that's where the museums, archives, and libraries are accommodated. So that's the directorate that actually looks after the heritage sites. And that's where Culture Leicestershire is best as a flagship program that offers culture provision, so to say. And within that is the unit that now calls itself Libraries and Heritage Services that looks after Leicestershire County Council's culture and heritage sites. The fourth one is the Children and Family Services Directorate. Obviously, looks after children's care, children's social care and school support. And then we've got Public Health, obviously, looks after general health care. And puts out programs such as, smoking cessation programs, for example, where they want to create a smoke-free Leicestershire by 2030. How that will happen, arts and culture might feature in that, maybe not, we don't know yet. And the last directorate, which is the 6th, is the Chief Executive's Office Directorate. Now that provides sort of the strategic policy direction and leadership of the council. So with the exception of corporate services, I think we had individuals and teams within those other directorates that we spoke to, either as groups or individuals or part of our focus groups. Okay, so we had people there from the environment. We had people there from working with youth, so from the Children's Directorate, and obviously Chief Executive, which we had a lot about, which oversees all the other directorates. So just to break that down for you. So the approach. So we have a question here. Why did we choose the approach that we took to the project? So by default, in a way, we weren't forced or compelled to, but co-production seemed to be the most appropriate, where we had academics, policymakers, and local communities coming together to work. And co-production here meant that we included people. Collectively, we crafted the research questions, although we had an overarching research question around how to best strategically align culture, the arts, heritage, and the creative industries. We had conversations around, yes, how should we formulate that in a way that everybody in the project really understands and is happy with what we are looking for. So there were a number of conversations and discussions and email correspondence back and forth, trying to work that out. So it was about setting priorities collaboratively. It was about gathering data, again, collaboratively. It was very much about communicating outputs, just like we're doing now, except that 2 or 3 policymakers are not with us today who would have wanted to be here with us. And we are collaboratively producing outputs. So one output was a conference, a project conference back in June this year. We are writing some blog posts as well, all collectively in the spirit of the co-production spirit. Sophie, you've talked about some of the parameters, I think, already, so no need to add to that. Well, some need to add to that, I think, because we could add in the in May it was, we organized what we called an online culture symposium. And what we did there was to invite policy officers from 3 other national county councils. So we had policy officers from the neighboring district or county of Finland, which is relatively rural. So somebody from Finland District Council. We had a policy officer from Derbyshire County Council, and we had a policy officer from Kent County Council as well. So we had 3 of those sharing their journeys around what the path towards creating a culture strategy for them in the context of those counties was like. And that was a massive learning curve. I think we did really take a lot away from that. Paulina, just a moment, is there anything you would like to pick up here, perhaps maybe in relation to the Chilean or Latin American perspective at all?
Yes, maybe I have some questions for you in relation to, yes, this alignment with culture-based work. Can you describe a little bit more the population, the cultural diversity, the origins of the population that live in Leicestershire?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, it's predominantly white, middle class, aging population. Often there's a couple of universities there that have produced quite a lot of art students, but for the most part, they tend to then leave Leicestershire. But there is a burgeoning art, like there's quite a big craft community there. There's quite a lot of making that goes on across Leicestershire. I'm thinking particularly of jewelry making, pottery. There's quite a lot of kind of amateur artist networks going on. I think generally though, the feeling was that Leicestershire artists aren't very well supported with their work. We can't give you numbers on how many artists there are across the region because there just hasn't been that kind of research taken place, unfortunately. Yeah, I think there was just quite a lot of general dissatisfaction amongst independent artists and cultural practitioners that there wasn't enough being done to support them in the region, and they were often having to look elsewhere for work. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. I think what I can comment on this topic is about, I can synthesize expectations and maybe a lot of deception from that sometimes arise in when people work in with this type of cultural policy engagement. In Chile, I think that in this project that I have with handcraft workers, and agricultural workers that are firstly surprised by our interest in what they do, and they have many expectations about what we can do together, but they also have a lot of deception because of this, what you talked about, that they are not visible in our society. They are not taken into into consideration, no, in different aspects of social life. And there's a constant feeling, no, that they are in the periphery, no, in the periphery of social life and Chilean life, despite the fact that in our history there has been a lot of also in the dictatorship, for instance, the many of mestizo cultural heritage expressions were instrumentalized because of the nation and the image that Pinochet wanted to create about what was to be a Chilean, no, a people that lived in Chile. So that is, I think, a topic that is interesting. How many expectations people have, and at the same time, these expectations, how they are, many of them broken by deception and around cultural policy.
That's interesting. You're mentioning that, Paulina, because as you're speaking there about, so one of the things we noted very early on, following on from Sophie's point about how we interacted with some of the independent artists and how they felt, they didn't feel the support from the local authorities. What we actually found was when we interacted with them during the consultation exercises and the focus groups, they were actually excited about we taking interest in their work, okay? But they came to the event. Some of them came to more than 2 events that we organized, simply because, there were things like the fact that these conversations are happening at all is something. But by the same token, they were saying, in a way, we've been here before. Okay, we've been involved in similar initiatives that, at the end of the day, did not really get anywhere. Okay, so we were quite cognizant of that fact, and we're just looking at ways in which we just want to keep those relationships going. And I think much of some of that is going to come up on the next slide. So moving on to language, academics, policymakers, local communities. Earlier, we were talking about culture and what it means, and we came up with very different, interesting words. Now imagine the language that we would use. Imagine academic jargon, policymakers speak, okay? That's too much even for academics sometimes within themselves alone. So we became very aware very early that we needed to be careful in relation to how we use language. Are our project stakeholders familiar with the language we're using? Are we sure that they're familiar and comfortable with the language that we are using as academics? So that was very interesting and one of the key learning points, because sometimes we might use the same words, but we might not get away with the same meaning. And that really struck me as a strong learning point. And on top of, based on that, actually, we came up with the idea that for the outputs, especially the blueprint, which will inform the development of the cultural strategy, that one way to work around the language barrier would be to present the discourses and narratives in various digestible formats appropriate for the different groups or stakeholders that we've been talking to, so that everybody sort of feels and takes ownership of what they've contributed. So that's informed the way we want to go forward. Sophie, you talked about the method as well. So is there anything you would like to add in terms of...
just that we began by taking an asset-based approach to this. Yeah. So one of the things, there seemed to be a big appetite across the council that they received an asset mapping document, something that just itemized and listed all of the stuff I mentioned. And they were also quite big on having an infographic. So that was something that we've been working to achieve. Obviously, the asset-based approach focuses on, it's very much used in kind of community politics and other types of public service assessment, focuses on capabilities rather than like needs and deficits. And we drew strongly on a resource. I really recommend the Local Governments Association's Cultural Strategy in a Box. It's like a how-to guide to writing a cultural strategy. Again, this issue of language, I've spent quite a long time trying to wrestle with how do I want to itemize everything on this asset mapping document. And I began by doing a PESTLE analysis, so looking at political, environmental, social, etc. factors. And then I changed it because I read another local government association guide called the Creative Places Strategic Guide. And they very much use creative economy language. So I reframed it as inputs, supply, demand, and impacts in terms of thinking about what Leicestershire has. The council loved that. So I thought, well, let's stick with it. But actually what I came to realize was it is not the asset mapping exercise that is interesting for us if we're thinking about our independence and what we learn with a critical lens. Like, the asset mapping process isn't very interesting, but what you learn by trying to put an asset map together about the internal politics and the complicated governance structures and who wants to say what and how, and actually how local councils are a makeup of very specific types of individuals with specific types of institutional knowledge. That was what was interesting. It wasn't the asset mapping exercise. It's what that exercise reveals about really micro kind of complicated structures of bureaucracy. So that's what I would say about method.
Thank you very much indeed, yeah. And sort of making that distinction there between people as professionals and people as personal characters as well, because sometimes those two things are not always the same. When you get to know people away from from policy business, you find that they're very critical of the organization culture in which they work. Some surprises, there were quite a lot of them, I think. On a positive note, I think the first one was how grateful we were that people gave of their time to speak to us, whether it was in consultation exercises or focus groups or interviews, whether it was online or face-to-face. We really appreciated that because these are people who are extremely busy. So taking time out of their day just to come and speak to us, not once or twice, but thrice in some instances, I think was great. The other surprise was we talked about culture-based work earlier and some of the words that we associate with culture, pleasure, enjoyment, social justice, etc. It became very clear that it's more than culture or culture-based work. People were talking about how the way they lead their lives has something to do with developments around climate change, for example. And we hadn't really thought about it from that perspective at all. Or the way that informs decisions about their health and how they manage their health. Okay, so things of that nature. So it wasn't really just about culture or culture-based work, but it was about themes or issues that really cut across people's lives. Okay, and again, some of the things that were mentioned earlier really came into play. So I think about innovation. So people innovating in terms of how they make sense of the world around them. Okay, so there was something there about conflict. How people navigate conflict, okay? There was something there I can think of, what it means to be human, humanity, lived experience. So there were quite a number of things there that one would not immediately associate with engagement with culture immediately. Okay, so moving on from that, which is the last part, and I think, is Valentina in? Valentina, do we have about 15 minutes? Is that,
yes,
yeah?
15 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay. So we have a question here. How might we imagine equitable collaborative partnerships on and around culture-based work among academics, policymakers, and local communities in future, given the sometimes tension-ridden sort of interaction between these stakeholders. So a few things that we've learned, and Sophie and Paulina will probably come up with, will share some more, and you might have some as well. Now, some of these you might have already encountered if you've engaged in research projects that have involved partners of different kinds, so it won't be new to you. But for some of us here, it might be new to us, or just if it's familiar to you, it might just be a reminder that some of the things you're doing perhaps will need to think about when engaging in multi-stakeholder partnerships, just things to bear in mind. So one of the things we found very useful is doing extensive background research on our partners. What it is that they're interested in, what are their motivations, what are they bringing to the table? I think we found that very, very useful. We were speaking earlier and talked about how community artists or participatory artists, or artists working within participatory contexts in the 60s and 70s used to call that knowing your patch, okay? So before you went into the community, you did almost what they call detective work, okay? Finding out who are the movers and shakers in this space, who are the gatekeepers, where are the best cafes, when are they most busy, and might that be the time to recruit people to work with, okay? Power relationships. Academics are privileged people. Policymakers are powerful people, very powerful people. Local communities, well, not that much privileged, and certainly not that very powerful. So by default, there is a power differential there when all the three come together. And it's about how do we build in inclusive and participatory practice, so including ensuring a plurality of voices and perspectives regardless of people's backgrounds, and committing to fair remuneration for all partners. One thing I decided a couple of years ago after doing a co-production project was I would never do one if it's not costed in the budget. Now the reason for that is, and it's interesting, on the first day, Elie Belfiore was talking about the ethics of care for cultural workers, that they're not always paid what they're due, okay? So very often when we invite local communities or community partners to take part in these kinds of partnerships, we do not account for the emotional labor of sharing personal experiences, because that's work, okay? That's work, and that's never really recognized as such. So that's one thing that any partnerships to succeed, I think, or in our view, would have to remunerate everybody on the project the same way that policymakers are paid and that academics are paid salaries. Building meaningful relationships, this is, many of us will be very aware of that, but goes back to the point Sophie was making earlier around what is our role as academics, what is our position or positionality, and again, as you're saying earlier, in these partnerships. Are we there just to deliver the data and walk away? Or do we have a duty to actively shape the way policymakers think about things, make good decisions for the public good? Part of that is listening, because that's the best way we learn from others, and that's the best way to convey to others that we are taking them seriously and that we're taking on board what they're sharing with us. Expecting the unexpected. This is something anybody who has done a research project, I think, would say to us. So it's impossible to plan for all eventualities, really. So just being flexible, having backup options just in case things don't work. So a really little anecdote. So during the project, it was only just a 9 months project, but during that project, Sophie, for example, got a full-time position and therefore was not as available as before the project. That's not saying, so that was a change where we needed to act flexibly. But policymakers have also got briefs that they've got to pick up almost at short notice. And we had one of them actually being seconded to become director or co-director of the Midlands Freeport, for example. Okay, and she was one of the main co-investigators as well, and a pillar of the project. So again, there was improvisation there, so she invited somebody else to step in for her. But those are things that we have no control over, and really they were unexpected. But it's change that we cope with. And lastly, thinking long term. So building relationships is hard work. And I always remember, again, going back to the artists who work in participatory settings or community art settings, where they used to paracute in and paracute out and leave people almost to sort of fend for themselves, okay? So I think it's worth maintaining those relationships, because the way, if we continue that path towards working towards adapting models of governance that are very sympathetic of inclusion and participation, then partnerships involving policymakers and academics and local communities will always be needed, because it is always a collaborative effort. Sophie, I know you have got lots, but is there anything you wanted to add to these, or another one? Lots of things have come up, but we've just sort of got these 5 up.
No, probably something about, I feel like the way we've left Leicestershire County Council at the moment is I've become much more cognizant of their own internal problems of measurement and evaluation. And I think that's their biggest concern. I think we haven't particularly given them answers, which it wasn't our role to do, about how they can evaluate and measure their projects and their successes. And so I'm feeling quite troubled by that that's what they really need, that kind of data support, and that's what they haven't got. But I guess thinking about how that relates with building equitable futures for partnerships like that, I think it's just, like you said, managing expectations. Yeah, and I think my other thing is just being very, very aware that councils they're very complex in the way they're set up, and they really are made up of individuals with quite specific types of agendas, ones that we don't necessarily know. So I think it's having a kind of cognizance of that, I guess. Do you want to add anything?
Well, I think there are many points. Yes, I was thinking about an interview that I had with one of the art historians that work at the Museum of Contemporary Arts here in Santiago a few days ago, and what you said, Daniel, in respect to building meaningful relationships, I think that is very important in Chile's case also, because, for instance, this museum worker that is really. There are two women that are creating a whole archive that was not existent until 2 years ago, about the history of this very important institution in Chile. And the problem is how to build meaningful relationships if your institution lacks of infrastructure, budget, and many things that, well, today in Chile we have a crisis, a precariousness in cultural institutions that is very, very important, despite the budget that this government has expend in cultural institutions. But I think that there is a feeling of abandonment in some cultural institutions that in Spanish we always talked about circo pobre, no? And that we have to do everything with what we have, no? And I think there can be many creative initiatives with poor resources, but it has a strong impact in the feeling, affects. You talk about affects, no? In the feeling that your institution and culture is not important and is always has a very precarious a very precarious life in our society, no? And this is very contradictory with what we think about in Chile and in other countries in respect to public policy, no? And in the other hand, we have communities, no? We have independent initiatives that are very rich, but there is always this problem related to what in cultural institution is thought about participation, no? And passive and active participation, and what people are expecting about cultural projects, no? And that is very, I think there are many perspectives around participation, and I think is related to what you told about thinking long term, no? Thinking long term is engaging people in this kind of projects long term, but this is very difficult because of many factors, no? Age and living conditions, social inequality, cultural barriers, no? And we have to think in all of that. No?
Thank you very much, Paulina and Sophie earlier. What I'm taking away from that, I quite like that sentence, is doing things with what we've got, I think, is a very good way of thinking about it. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, right on time. Almost as if I anticipated you're going to say that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. And